This series of events is a part of We Keep Each Other Safe project and is one of our contributions to the work that is happening across our communities to address police violence, criminalization, and punishment, and all forms of state violence. This series of workshops is our attempt to bring together the people in our community to share resources and learn about some of the critical skills that we need to keep each other safe. We know that none of this work will be exhaustive and representative of all the needs that exist in our community. This is an invitation for us all to engage within the community building and bringing forward ideas, questions, and resources on the topic of community safety. Over the last few weeks, we have heard so many people in the community that have also started doing this work. These workshops will be recorded and shared online in several weeks from our Facebook and our website. The Suicide Intervention Workshop for Weirdos, Freaks, and Queers focuses on peer and community-based strategies for supporting folks in our lives who might be suicidal or struggling with suicidal ideations. We will also be examining the beliefs and structures that keep suicide conversations silenced. Today, we are honored and we welcome Carly Boyce. Carly is a 36-year-old queer fat femme who is a white settler descended from Polish Jews. They are a facilitator, writer, therapist, and community organizer. Carly has been doing decarceral suicide prevention work informally for 20 years and teaching about it for the last 5, training over 1,000 people in several cities on Turtle Island. You can learn more about them at tinylantern.net or follow them on Instagram at tiny.lantern. So Carly, welcome and thank you so much, and take it away.
Hello. Thanks for having me and thanks for that introduction. I'm gonna share my screen so that you can see my slides. So fancy. We're going to start by just talking about a couple of the kind of norms I like to set for a space like this. So the first one is privacy. This is a webinar, so there's not too many ways for people to share, but there will be some invitations to participate in the chat. So share in the ways that feel good to you on this day in this way, and knowing that this is being recorded. I trust you to use your discretion. Power, I want to say a couple of things about power. The first one is that I'm not an expert. I'm not here to teach you all of my great wisdom. I'm someone who's held spaces like this for a long time and has some collected wisdom to share that mostly are not my ideas. But it's not unbiased and it's not scientific. I believe our experiences are evidence. You don't have to agree with me, and you're welcome to take from this what works for you and leave what doesn't make sense. We live in this world, and that means that racism and misogyny and transphobia and colonialism and ableism are all here with us on this webinar in this world. And that includes in me, right? I'm not perfect. I've internalized and absorbed some of the bullshit of the world that we live in. And my perspective is limited in some ways by my social location. I'm a white person, I'm a middle-class person, I'm queer. The land that I live on is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, a pre-contact agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples to share resources and try not to use violence. And as a treaty person, we are all treaty people. I do my best to live up to those expectations. Permission. What I want to say about permission is that I trust you to take care of yourself for the next hour and a half or 2 hours in the ways that work for you. If you need to hold a big rock or light a candle or lie down or take breaks or leave and watch this later if you want to, those things are all fine. You don't have to pay attention to me. If we were in a space where people were invited to have their cameras on, I'd be like, don't. You don't need to. Take care of yourself. This subject is heavy and it brings up a lot for people. Participation, just to let you know, I will be inviting you to think about some things, to try some things out. Some of them I'll ask you to try saying something. I won't know if you do it or don't, but it's an invitation for you if you want to. Obviously, all those things you'll do with your camera and your mics off. And there will be some times where you'll be invited to say some things in the chat. Yeah, those are the norms for the space. I can tell you a little bit about me and how I came to be doing work like this. So I've been doing suicide support informally since I was a kid. I think my first friend told me they were suicidal when I was 13. And I panicked and had a lot of feelings about it. I've spent a couple of years of my own life seriously suicidal and have been supporting people in my life and communities who are suicidal in various ways and for various lengths of time for about 20 years. And I started teaching about suicide after I took an assist training in my late 20s, and I hated it. Just to say that I think assist training is like useful and people should do it if they can. I don't think it, I think it has some important contributions to the world of suicide intervention, but I have two kind of principal critiques of it. The first one is that it's really, really expensive, and so it's hard to access. And the other one is that it rests on policing as a backup. The kind of bottom line of those trainings is if you don't know what to do, or if you feel in over your head, call 911. And for the people that I've been supporting in my life and for the people in my communities, sometimes that's not a great option. And sometimes it's actually a really dangerous option. And so I wanted to have other kinds of conversations about what we could do if people in our life are at risk. And I couldn't find anybody having those conversations outside of that kind of carceral lens. And so I made one. And again, that frame wasn't like, here I am to teach you the things, but rather I have a lot of questions and I don't have a lot of answers, and maybe we can come up with some together. Yeah, that's some stuff about me. The way that this workshop kind of goes is that we're going to talk about some theory, which is basically talking through some ideas that I think kind of are pervasive in our culture about how suicide works and how suicide intervention works, and the ways that those ideas impact people who are suicidal. Then we're going to take a short break just so people can like breathe and pee and drink water. And then we're going to talk about some skills, some concrete strategies that you can use in conversations about suicide. And then we'll do a brief closing. We will probably be here until about 8. We will not go over 8. So let's talk about some beliefs. If we were doing this in a more kind of interactive setting, we'd break up into little groups, and each group would have one of these ideas and the 3 following questions. How true is this? Who believes it and why? And what would happen if nearly everyone believed it? So for each of these 5 ideas, we would spend some time kind of deconstructing them together and thinking about the impacts that they have. Instead, I'm just going to kind of give you the Coles notes of the conversations that I've had about these ideas over the last several years to sort of highlight some of the pieces that tend to come up around them. The TLDR version is, these things aren't true, or at least they're not as true as we sometimes think they are, and that they have some really, really dangerous impacts. So let's start with the first one. Bringing up suicide with someone who's having a hard time might make them want to do it. This is a sneaky idea because a lot of people read that and think, I don't believe that. That doesn't really make sense to me. But we behave as though we believe it. We embody this belief, even if we don't hold it in a logical way. And we see that in ourselves when somebody that you care about is like across the table from you or across a Zoom screen from you, and they're saying things that make you really worried, and little red flags are going up in your mind that are like, ooh, this person isn't okay. And we don't automatically or easily say, hey, are you thinking about suicide? Or like, I'm worried that you're thinking about suicide. Is that something that's coming up for you? Those words don't like roll easily out of our mouths. And I think this idea is a big part of why. I've come to believe over time that it's more dangerous not to talk about suicide than it is to talk about it. When ideas are shrouded in secrecy and stigma and shame, they're hard to seek support around. It really reminds me of the way that people talk about sex and young people, where we're just like, shh, don't tell them that they can have sex and they'll never figure it out. And the truth is, like, people have been figuring out how to fuck and how to die as long as there have been humans on this planet. It's not actually a secret, but when we surround it with that kind of secrecy, it becomes really stigmatized and really taboo and really, really hard to talk about. I think an idea that kind of lives underneath this idea is also that people who are suicidal are really fragile. And we're really, really scared that we're going to do or say the wrong thing. And with one wrong move or one wrong word, that person will just shatter like glass. And I think that idea is really unfair, and it really does a disservice to suicidal people, especially suicidal people who have those ideas or thoughts in a long-term or recurring way. Suicidal people are actually geniuses at staying alive. They do it every day, sometimes under impossible circumstances. And so I think we do a huge disservice to people when we imagine them as fragile, and we imagine ourselves as the person who's hearing about this maybe for the first time. Suddenly we're very powerful and we're in control and that person isn't. It's a misunderstanding of our own responsibility and power. This second idea, it's possible to predict which people who have suicidal feelings will try to end their lives. There's like a couple of places this shows up. One of them is in kind of like demographic research. So people will be like, oh, like queer and trans youth are more likely to die by suicide, or Indigenous people are more likely to die by suicide. And we hold those ideas sometimes closer or as more true than what we're hearing from the people that we're talking to directly. So we'll disbelieve someone in favor of believing a stat that we've heard or we've been taught. I think that sucks and is dangerous. And then the other way it comes up is through the kind of like clinical methods that if you have any kind of training around suicide intervention that comes through a formal space, you've probably heard the kind of checklisty questions that we tend to ask people when they talk about feeling suicidal or having ideas about suicide. Questions like, do you have a plan? Do you have the means by which you would carry out that plan? Do you have a date in mind when you would carry that plan out? And that's based on some research that was done a really long time ago with straight white middle-class men about how likely those folks were to attempt suicide based on, those questions being answered with yeses. So first of all, that research is super limited. It doesn't cover all of our experiences. And it also kind of only is thinking about people who are thinking about suicide over a period of time rather than people who do it kind of more impulsively. So that set of questions, that's the kind of like gold standard, what you would find in a hospital or a social service agency, just misses a huge proportion of suicidal people's experiences. And it's used as a gatekeeping tool to deny people services. It's also used as a way that professionals protect ourselves, from litigation around suicide, so that if somebody dies by suicide, we can say, I did the checklist. I did what I was supposed to do. You know, it indicated that this person wasn't a high risk, so it's not my fault. And I think this is my biggest kind of flag around the ways that we try to guess which people who think about suicide or talk about suicide are really going to do it. Is that the way that we think about that is so much more about our own anxieties and taking care of ourselves than it is about taking care of those people who are having those feelings in that moment. It is, in fact, not possible to predict which people who have suicidal feelings will try to end their lives. And that's a difficult truth to hold, but I think that it's true. Another kind of thing that comes up around this idea is people who aren't serious, what we sometimes think of as like attention seeking, or someone who's doing a cry for help. And somehow somebody crying for help or seeking attention societally and systemically, what we've decided is that that means that person shouldn't have either of those things. They shouldn't have help and they shouldn't get attention. And that just seems really counterintuitive and also quite cruel. And so I think those ideas are really, really harmful and really damaging. The third idea, if you struggle with suicidal feelings, you can't support someone else who is suicidal. This is a tricky one. I think the idea of capacity often comes up when we talk about this in workshops, that like there are some days, some moments, and some entire humans for their whole lives who are like, I actually can't, just can't. That's too much for me, that's too big for me, and that is legitimate and okay. You are not obligated to do suicide support. It is not your job to do suicide support. But nobody but you gets to decide what your capacity is or what you are able or not able to do. That's each of our decision for ourselves. think monitoring and knowing about our capacity is like a skill that takes a lot of practice to figure out how to know what our capacity is. And I think we have some responsibility to try to do that and do it well. But I certainly don't think that having a history or even a present of thinking or feeling towards suicide disqualifies you from being able to support other people. I know some folks for whom it's the direct opposite. Supporting someone else can allow them to take a break from their own feelings, can allow them to connect with another person, to feel like they have a purpose, feel like they're useful. And all of those things for some folks, some of the time, can be life-saving measures. This idea also doesn't hold up if we think about it outside of the context of suicide. So for example, the only people who should coach basketball are people who have never played, right? That idea doesn't make any sense. Having experience with something can uniquely equip someone to be able to support other people. And all of our experiences are different. So you're also not the only person who can help if you've had that experience. I think all of us, whatever our experiences have been in the past, can develop the skills to be supportive around suicide if we want to and if we decide to. The fourth idea is that there are experts who know how to handle suicidal people and they know best. I think what's helpful about expertise mostly is about practice and comfort. It is useful to have had some practice and develop some comfort with conversations about suicide. They do get easier if you have those things. But in terms of what expertise usually kind of indicates, often that's about like having a fancy degree, being an old white guy, having a really particular set of like clinical ideas about what kind of people are okay, right? Being invested in this system of ableism and systems of hierarchy and power. And also like, if you have been helped by like a formalized system, that's also cool, right? We're all doing our best to survive with like what we can access and what's available to us. There's nothing wrong with leaning on experts. And also there are lots of people who aren't represented by experts, who don't feel understood by experts, or don't feel safe with experts. I think the thing that's tempting about this idea is that it reassures us sometimes if we do feel kind of like in over our heads or we're not sure what to do. The idea that there are experts who know what to do can feel really comforting. And so it can feel a bit tough to kind of bust that one as a myth, be like, oh, actually, maybe you as the person who's this person's best friend or partner or cousin or whatever, maybe you're the best expert that's available. And maybe you don't need any kind of formalized knowledge in order to be with this person that you care about who's struggling. Number 5 is kind of the spicy meatball of the crew. You should always do whatever is necessary to save a life, no matter what. That idea often just like sits heavy with people. For some people, it feels really true. When we're talking about life and death, we feel like we just must. There is no space for no, there's no space for boundaries. And I think that's a pretty dangerous idea in terms of also having people who do support work continue to survive and be able to do that work over time. We need a lot of people on the team and we need to be able to stick around. This idea also like brings up a lot of questions that are difficult to answer and deeply subjective about, you know, what even is death? What happens after we die? Who gets to decide if death is okay or not okay? And under what circumstances? And who gets to choose? And what are the factors at play? There's like a lot of really big kind of spiritual questions that are brought up by this idea. And I think that those feelings are playing out when we're faced with someone in our lives who is suicidal. So I'm not here to tell you what to believe about whether suicide is okay or not okay and under what circumstances. I think that's up to everybody to kind of figure out for themselves what they believe. Also, it's allowed to change. My beliefs around it have changed several times, and I think they'll keep changing. What I do think we have a responsibility to do is try to figure it out so that we can be honest and transparent with the people we're supporting about what we believe. There's a diversity of beliefs about whether suicide is okay or not okay and under what circumstances among people who do suicide intervention and support. And there's also a diversity of beliefs about whether suicide is okay or not okay and under what circumstances among people who are actively suicidal. There are people who are actively suicidal who think that suicide is bad and wrong and will send them straight to hell. And that is a particularly intense and unique kind of suffering that you might be able to connect on if you share that belief as a supporter. I want people who are seeking support to be able to get information about who should support them and when. And I think we can give people more information by having a sense of what our beliefs are. I think this idea also really brings up kind of big sort of social questions about like whose lives are considered valuable. I would like to live in a world where all of our lives are valuable, and I don't think we currently live in that one. That there are certain lives that are considered much less valuable or more disposable than others. And I don't know if we have any quick fixes for how to shift that, but I think it's something that we should be working on and thinking about. I think it's a real kind of violence that's been done to a kind of whole society by white supremacy and capitalism and colonization, that we really struggle to hold people close to us when they're struggling. So when people are too sick or too old or too crazy or too mean, in too much pain, we want to send them away. And sometimes that away is a prison, and sometimes that away is a hospital, and sometimes that away is an old folks home. But we really want people to kind of leave community and get better, and then maybe they can come back if they get better. And I think we have to ask ourselves some big questions about what better means, and who's welcome, and who's allowed, and who's valuable, and what place people can have while they're struggling inside of the community. So those are kind of my like Cole's notes of what comes up around those beliefs. And maybe we can take a sort of short pause and see if there are any questions that are coming up for people, things you want to add, things that those ideas bring up for you.
There's one question here that we received on the board. Belief one makes me think of clusters of suicide deaths that make the news and have resulted in First Nations calling a state of emergency. Could you talk about this in connection to how we have this false belief that bringing up suicide makes people want to do it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know that I have the answers about suicide clusters. I know that there are some kind of like media beliefs that people talk about around, not media beliefs, media guidelines around like disclosing publicly that people have died by suicide. And there's often this kind of like veil of secrecy that surrounds those deaths in an effort to prevent further deaths. And I don't know all the research on it, but I don't personally believe that that works. I think that the pervasive silence makes it harder to talk about and harder to seek support around. And I think the clusters maybe have more to do with a kind of like collective hopelessness or feeling of being devalued or forgotten by society or by a certain community. But yeah, I don't know that I have a lot of answers about that. I think the only other thing that makes me think of is sort of the things that come up around what makes life livable, and that communities that are in states of emergency around suicide are often also in states of emergency around like the availability of resources. So when people are living in poverty, when people don't have access to clean water, when people don't have access to food, when people don't have access to elders and spirituality and connection, that those things are contributing to that crisis of suicide in a really significant way. Any other contributions from the room?
There's one more here from Scarlett that says, how are we supposed to identify when not to intervene?
Where is he getting these questions from?
This one's in the chat.
Oops.
Yeah.
Yeah, how are we supposed to know when to intervene and when not to intervene? I mean, I think that that question we'll get
What
maybe
time do you
more
have
in.
the phone till?
We'll maybe get more into that later in the workshop, but I think my sort of preliminary questions back would be like, what does intervention mean, right? What do we mean when we say intervene? And sometimes what we mean by that is like take away someone else's agency, and sometimes what we mean by that is like ask a person a question about how they're doing. And I think we can almost always do the second thing. All right. So those are those beliefs. These are the questions we talked about. I think it's a really helpful kind of test to apply to kind of big pervasive beliefs, to just sort of check in if there's something that you find yourself believing or you hear a lot, to be like, oh, do I think this is true? Who do I think believes it, and where does that belief come from? And what would happen if everybody believed it? And the kind of like underlying question of that impact is also like, who benefits? Who benefits from this belief, and who's punished because of this belief? And if the answer to that question is like all the people with power benefit and the people without power don't, then like maybe it's not a great belief. We're going to start talking about some of the skills and strategies that we can use in conversations about suicide. And I want to offer a couple of framing ideas that for me really inform how I think about this work. The first one I call Hoffman's rule because it comes from a person called Dr. Hoffman, who's a real human. He was the first person to train me formally on suicide intervention when I was volunteering at a sexual assault center in university. And he was also my first psychiatrist, because when you're queer, dual relationships are just all around you. And at the beginning of his trainings about suicide intervention, the first thing that Dr. Hoffman says is, when you find yourself talking to someone who's thinking about suicide, don't panic and do nothing. Don't panic and do nothing. And what he means by that isn't like become a tree, stop interacting with the person that you're interacting with, but more like the conversation you're having doesn't actually have to be radically different than any other conversation you would have with that person. Your personality still gets to exist. Your sense of humor still gets to exist. You don't have to radically alter your tone of voice or your body position. 5 minutes ago, maybe you were talking about homework, or you were talking about your family, or you were talking about a TV show you watched. And you don't have to be different than you were when you were talking about one of those things when you're talking about suicide. Especially if you have any kind of like training on peer support or other ways that support work happens. A lot of people sort of develop a caring stance, a sort of different voice, a different posture, a different way of being, where we're like, and now I am doing the caring thing. And I think that's a way we protect ourselves. It's to try to create a little bit more distance so that we're not as impacted by the things we're hearing. And that's an intelligent strategy, and it's a loving strategy. And I think in the case of suicide, it doesn't serve us or the people that we're supporting. I want to advocate for people to stay close when things are really hard, rather than putting distance between us and the people we're supporting. And I think that caring posture kind of does that. It says, this is big, this is different. And I don't know if I can be with that. That feels really scary. So don't panic and do nothing. And then the other idea that I think about a lot, I kind of like lifted this as a phrase from a young adult fiction book that I like called The Basic Eight, written by Daniel Handler. And this is Baker's rule. Mr. Baker is a math teacher in that book. And when students in Mr. Baker's math class are trying to write a test and they're struggling and they're like, Mr. Baker, I don't know how to answer number 3. He says, try something. Try something. You might get further than you thought. You might actually get the whole answer. You might figure something out along the way. And the kind of most bare bones version of Baker's rule in the context of suicide intervention is any time that you're spending with a suicidal person is time that they are not spending ending their life. So probably you're helping, even if it's short term, even if it's temporary. So don't panic, do nothing, try something are ideas I try to hold sort of together when I'm in conversations with people about suicide. Holding space as a concept, I think, has gotten some popularity over the last couple of years. It's a phrase I've heard a lot more of. And I think it's sometimes hard to figure out what it actually means. I think that holding space can be almost anything, as long as what you're doing is staying close, whether emotionally or physically, to someone who's having a hard time and not trying to change what's happening. Holding space is like walking alongside of, or being with, or sitting on the bench with. It's like noticing what's going on and witnessing what's going on, being willing to acknowledge how big and how scary it is, and not necessarily trying to shift it, because probably you don't have that much power. It's unlikely that you have within you the power to radically alter somebody's life circumstance, to erase the traumatic thing that just happened in their life, or radically alter their housing situation or their food security situation or their feelings about their breakup. Whatever is happening, it's unlikely that you have the power to change it, but you do have the power to witness it. And that's actually a very big deal. So holding space can look like sharing food, playing a video game, cuddling, going for a walk, baking a cake, shooting hoops, chopping wood, doing a jigsaw puzzle, praying together, eating a meal together on Zoom, watching a Netflix show together and texting. It can look like almost anything, as long as it makes sense in the context of the relationship you have with that person and you're trying to be with and witness without changing what's happening. Because this is kind of a workshop format, we're also going to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we do that with our words. But it feels important to name that it doesn't have to look like talking. It can just look like spending time with somebody and being with them while they're having a really difficult time. In terms of words, what I want to do is read you a list of kind of affirming or validating statements that I have tended to use a lot of in conversations about suicide. And this list also contains lots of things that weren't my idea, that came up in workshops like this one that stuck with me. This isn't the definitive list of things to say, and it's certainly not a list of things that will always feel good to everyone to hear. It's just some ideas, and to kind of build a couple of kind of back pocket things that you might be able to pull out in a moment where you feel challenged about what to say. So I'm just going to read you a list, and then I'm going to invite people to add into the chat things that you have either said or heard that felt good in a difficult moment, or things that, you might want other people to know is language that they could use in that kind of context. So here's my list. I care about you. Thanks for trusting me with this. I believe you. That sounds really hard. It's so fucked up that you have to deal with that. If there are ways I can have your back, I want to. I love you at your worst. You matter to me. That's some heavy shit. That's so real. Thank you for naming that. I'm here. I signed up for this. I'm in your corner. This is what it's like right now. So just take a minute to think about maybe conversations that you've had. And if you want to, you can share in the chat affirming or validating statements that have felt good to you, or that you think might have felt good to people you've said them to. Someone wrote, "You don't deserve this pain. You matter." You are enough. You are doing enough. I'm grateful for this time with you. These are lovely. I see you as love. Your feelings are valid. I'll check in with you at this time tomorrow. Sometimes when I invite people to think about things that have sat well, what comes up is what hasn't sat well. And so I also just want to invite folks, if what's coming up for you is like something that someone said to you that felt really bad, maybe specify in brackets like bad, so we can tell the difference. But yeah, it's okay if what's coming up for you is things that haven't sat well. I'm listening, I hear you. It does hurt and you don't have to like it. You deserve attention, especially when being told by others behavior is attention seeking or facing that stigma. Yeah, definitely. Something that hasn't felt as good for someone is something like look at the upside, or at least sort of trying to drag someone into better feelings. Get over it, also on the unhelpful side. Yeah, for sure. Bad options, really solution-focused therapy statements like, what are 5 things you can do to help you cope, or what's your safety plan for today? Someone asked for a repeat of the original list, so I'm happy to read those again. Also, maybe a thing that I will tell you is that I compiled sort of some of the major learnings from the workshop into a zine. And I am happy to like send people copies of that zine. I have it both electronically and on paper. I'm extremely Googleable. And you're welcome to reach out to me for copies of the zine. I used to sell them, but now I just give them to people. It's tricky to figure out how to survive capitalism and also get people the resources that they need. Okay, I'm going to read this list again, and then I'm going to move us into the next section. I care about you. Thanks for trusting me with this. I believe you. That sounds really hard. It's so fucked up that you have to deal with that. If there are ways I can have your back, I want to. I love you at your worst. You matter to me. That's some heavy shit. That's so real. Thank you for naming that. I'm here. I signed up for this. I'm in your corner. This is what it's like right now. I want to give just a couple of notes about like supportive phrases in the context of conversations. One of them goes back to this thing about worrying that people are fragile and that you're going to say the wrong thing and that saying the wrong thing will be disastrous. And in fact, I want to promise you that at some point you're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to say something that you can tell doesn't sit right with someone, and you'll notice it. You'll see it in their face, or you'll see it in their body language, or you'll hear it in their voice. And then what you're going to do is take a minute, take a breath, and then you're going to say, I'm sorry, that didn't come out quite right, or I can see that that's not sitting well with you. I'm just trying to figure out how to be here with you. I don't know what to say. You do not have to know what to say. You also don't have to be the most creative and poetic speaker to do this kind of work. If all you do is say, I love you 22 times in a conversation, you've done something really important. And repetition can actually be useful. If somebody's feeling particularly worthless or in a place where it's really hard for them to receive positive information about themselves, hearing someone say, I love you and I believe you over and over again can be really useful. So don't feel like you have to be kind of the most interesting. Say things that you think are true. Only say things you believe. Say them like you mean them, and say them lots of times. And if you mess up, take responsibility for that and keep going. Okay, let's move on to the next piece. Asking explicitly about suicide. So we talked like in the beginning part about how it can be really scary to name suicide out loud, and that there's this kind of deeply ingrained cultural belief that it's actually dangerous to talk about suicide. And I think one of the most powerful interventions that we can make is asking someone if they're thinking about suicide. Here's the wildest part. Even if you don't have a conversation about it, even if they say no, even if you never talk about suicide, what you've done by asking one of these questions is plant a seed, let somebody know that you'd be willing to talk about it if they wanted to. And for some people in some moments, just that is like a life-giving, hope-giving measure. Just that somebody would, somebody who cares, somebody who's interested, someone who noticed that maybe they're not okay. So I think asking one of these questions when you are close to people who are struggling is like one of the most important things that you can do. In workshops, we run this as a circle. We pass an object, usually a weird stuffed toy like a sparkly pink koala, around in a circle, and we ask it, are you thinking about suicide? Or do you mean you're considering killing yourself? Or are you thinking about ending your life? And the reason that we do that is because there's some research that I can't cite that tells us that saying something difficult is easier if you have practice. If you've just like felt the words coming out of your mouth before, when you need them, they'll be more available to you and they'll come out better. There's a big difference between, are you thinking about suicide? And hey buddy, are you thinking about suicide? And so I think it can help us to have a little bit of practice. And so this is a moment where I'm going to invite you to, mics off, but just like see if you feel okay about saying one of these things out loud to your computer screen, to your glass of water, to the rock that you're holding, so that question will be more readily available to you in a time that you might need it. I'm just going to pause and let people take a second to experiment with that. If anybody did that and you're willing to share, you can let me know in the chat what that felt like, what that was like to do, or what it was like to try to do. It was surprisingly hard at first, and I felt the words roll easier towards the end. Yeah, totally. It can be helpful to practice it more than once. Someone else said I felt shaky in my voice to begin. I kept repeating it and tried different sentences until it felt a bit more comfortable. Practice, it does so much for us. It's a lot easier to say without a loved one present. Yeah, that makes sense. It can feel really heavy, right? Naming suicide explicitly can bring up past experiences that we've had or that people that we're connected to have had. Kind of like, I think about it as like, I don't know if our brains are like internet browsers, but I think about it like opening up all the tabs. We're just like that horrible tab and that horrible tab and that horrible tab all really come up. And those things are present in our bodies when we're thinking about suicide. And that makes sense, right? We're human creatures and we want to protect ourselves. And so I think some practice of like noticing those feelings and being able to speak through them can really help us in that project. Something that sometimes happens in that kind of workshop circle is that people will try to ask a question that feels softer, feels easier. And sometimes that sounds like, are you thinking about harming yourself? Or are you thinking about hurting yourself? And those aren't bad questions. You are totally welcome to use those questions, but they're also not the same question. And asking someone if they're thinking about hurting themselves or harming themselves is actually not the same. The answer to that might not be the same as, are you thinking about killing yourself? Or are you thinking about ending your life? And I think it is important, especially early in a support relationship, early in talking about suicide with somebody, to be really explicit and be really, really clear that you both know what you're talking about. Some people over time develop kind of like shorthand, and I think that's just fine as long as you're both on the same page about what the shorthand means, right? So for some people, that question might eventually sound like, on a scale of 1 to 10, like, how loud are the brain weasels today? And if it's over a 7, that means like something needs to happen. There's some care that's needed. You don't always have to use the word suicide, especially if that doesn't feel great for you or for the person that you're supporting. But I do think it's important to have that clarity early on. Another thing that sometimes happens is that this feels awkward because we're not used to talking about suicide. We're not used to talking about death. It doesn't come sort of easily or naturally to a lot of us. And so we feel a bit uncomfortable, and we're worried we're making someone else uncomfortable. And somebody might be taken aback, right? Somebody might be surprised that you're asking them that question, and that's okay. Something that happens pretty often is that the first time I ask somebody about suicide, they answer no quite quickly. And then they might come back and talk about it a couple of weeks later, or even a couple of years later, because that information that somebody is willing really sticks. There's a question in here. It says, is it helpful to ask these questions to friends outside of a crisis situation so that they know we're someone they can reach out to? Totally. Yeah, I do think that that's useful. We'll talk a little bit about safety planning later on, and that's like one of the pieces that I think can be part of that. But thank you for that question. I think another thing that sometimes people do is like accidentally invite a really specific answer to that question. So like these 3 questions are pretty open, like, are you thinking about this? Are we talking about this? And so I wouldn't want to ask it like, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? Or like, suicide isn't something I have to worry about with you, is it? Those are questions that say like, please say no, please say no, please say no. I'm really not ready to hear a yes from you on this. And so I think just paying attention to, use the language that makes the most sense for you in the context of your life and your relationship with the person you're talking to, but don't kind of aggressively invite a no. Another thing that sometimes people worry about in asking these questions is that we're coercing someone into having a conversation they don't want to have. And I think as long as we're talking about peer-based situations, not ones where you have some kind of like formal or structural power over the person that you're asking, if they don't want to talk to you about it, they just won't. They'll lie. And if you still feel a worry in your gut about them, you can like ask again later or try a different way to offer support. But they also don't have to talk to you if they don't want to. That's also allowed. Somebody asked, is it your opinion that the social determinants of suicide actually exist? Can you speak to that in relation to First Nations calling a state of emergency and suicide epidemics? I do believe that the social determinants of suicide actually exist. I believe that power and privilege and the way that resources are distributed impact whose lives are livable and whose lives are survivable. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of reasons why some communities who are more marginalized are at a greater risk of suicide. And there's this like weird thing where there's a lot of kind of money and research available around suicide because it also like happens to everyone, because people like Robin Williams also die by suicide. That there's this sort of idea that it could happen to anyone. And I think, it's true. Like there are mental health concerns in all sorts of communities for all sorts of reasons. But I absolutely think that there is an impact that comes from things like poverty and oppression. I think those things absolutely have an impact on whose lives are livable, and who has resources to try to survive difficult circumstances. Okay. Safety planning. So safety planning, as far as the way that I think about it, it has sort of two different modes. There's two different times that you can be doing safety planning with somebody. The first one is absolutely my favorite one. And I think of that as planning for a storm. So this is safety planning that you're doing outside of a crisis moment. You could do this kind of anytime. There are people in your life who you know have been in crisis before or might be in crisis again, or something really big and life-shaking is going on, or like a really tragic event has happened. I think it makes a lot of sense to sit down with people that you care about and be like, if this gets worse, how can I be there for you? And I think part of the insidious impact of that first belief we talked about, that talking about suicide is inherently dangerous, it prevents us from doing some of this planning ahead of time because we're so scared that talking about a crisis will bring on a crisis. And I think that that's a really dangerous kind of limitation that we put on ourselves. And so I think it is absolutely a good idea for us to talk with each other about what it looks like when we're in crisis, what it looks like when we're not okay, what we might need, what we might really, really not want, what might be harmful to us in those circumstances. And then the other kind I think of as like driving in a storm. And that's like, okay, you're already in the crisis. The crisis is happening. And so you have to figure out how to kind of move through it. So we'll kind of talk a little bit more about both of those things. Ooh, I don't have another slide about them. I'm just going to talk about them. So in planning for a storm, I think I like imagine this like other world where we're more kind of focused on care and support inside of relationships. There's more space for that and more attention for that. And this is something that happens when people like eat a meal together, as like give each other information about what it looks like when we're not okay, what we might need and what we might want, and who should be involved and who really shouldn't be involved. And that as those things change, we update each other. Maybe we even write those things down. There are some resources where you can use like a map that's kind of like make like a flow chart of like, if this thing comes up, then like these are the steps. And if this thing comes up, then these are some of the steps. And I think both as people who maybe are sometimes supporting people who have crises and as people who have crises, we can open up these conversations with people in our lives to talk about what that's like so that we can, you know, reduce the likelihood that one of those crises could be fatal. So some of the kind of guiding questions that I'm going to offer can help you kind of like put some of that together with people in your life if you want to. They're not super, super specific. They're just kind of to get you started on those conversations. And I've said some of them already. So what does it look like when you're not okay? Who do you feel okay being around when you're not okay? What got you through your last crisis or your last few crises? What sucked about your last crisis that you want to make sure doesn't happen again? What are activities that can help pass the time in your hardest moments? Who are people who you can count on to text back quickly or answer their phones or show up? Do you have the names and phone numbers of important support people, friends, family, therapists, hotlines, somewhere you can easily find them? And can I have some too? Can I also have contact information for some of those folks so that I can get in touch with them if you need them? So that's a little bit about the kind of pre-planning kind. And then in terms of like, if you find yourself already in a crisis, again, it's like super circumstantial and contextual based on who is this person and what is your relationship to them and what's happened between you in the past. But I think the analogy of like driving in a blizzard is a helpful one, because when you're driving in a blizzard, you can't sort of think more long-term about like what's going to happen in a half an hour or what are you going to get to, you know, in 10 miles. It's like, what's right in front of the car? What can I see? What do I need to focus on in order to like stay alive? Is like what's directly in front of me. So I think in a crisis moment, I really encourage folks to stay really, really small and really, really close when you're talking about what happens. So for example, you're not going to be like, we just have to get you through till you move out of your parents' house, or like, you just have to finish this degree, or you just have to get through this probation, right? It's like, how are we going to get you through the next 5 minutes? How are we going to get you through the next 10 minutes? I think our first kind of like set of interventions in a crisis are about attending to basic body needs, remembering that we're creatures and that our bodies have needs, and that attending to those can have an impact on how we feel. I'm sure like lots of us have had the experience of feeling really, really fucked up, and then like eating a snack and feeling just a little bit less fucked up. It doesn't make the problem go away, but it increases your capacity to hold it. So I think either getting these things for someone or encouraging them to get them is like water, food, movement, breath, bathing, a hug, adjustment of temperature, adjustment of environment, increased amounts of safety. So like locking doors, finding blankets, those kinds of things can have a little bit of a calming effect. In a crisis, you're not going to solve the problem, right? You're not going to make disappear the thing that's causing the distress, but you might be able to make the distress easier to manage. Outside of those kind of basic body needs things, I think the next sort of set of things that I think about fall into 3 kind of interrelated categories, which are describe, distract, and delay. So describe kind of goes back to the holding space piece. It's just like, tell me everything. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what's around you. Tell me where you are. What do you see? What do you feel? All of that stuff. Closeness, validations, affirmations. Distract is like, can we pass a bit of time? Obviously, generalizations are like hard to apply and they don't work for everybody, but there is some like data that most people's nervous systems can only hold like a really intense state of activation for about 20 minutes. So for some people, it's like about watching the clock. It's like, how do we get you through this 20-minute period of time? And after that 20 minutes, it's not like things get awesome, but the kind of volume can get turned down just a little bit. There are folks who can really easily get kind of re-triggered and back into that 20-minute cycle over and over again. So that's like it's not a guarantee that things will calm down after 20 minutes, but it can be a helpful guideline to think about what's the amount of time that I want to try to fill. So you could, watch YouTube videos of screaming goats or of like pugs being puppies, or play a video game or watch something, but something that just kind of will like occupy some of that person's attention until things get a little bit easier. And delay is kind of related. It's about like taking up time. And sometimes it's about, for some people, what delay looks like is talking about the plan. What would it be like to execute that plan? And can we plan it for tomorrow, or can we plan it for next week? Like, tell me about what you're going to do and just try to decide to not do it right now. So to delay the actual plan for suicide. I think too a little bit about the kind of like the senses and also the like elements, like how can we use those things to transform a little bit of how we feel? So like showers aren't just about like being clean. You can also like use the intention of like, I'm washing this feeling away, or I'm washing this experience away. Or like going outside, like going for a walk, those things can really like engaging with our senses can help just like take some of the attention away from the place that's really hurting, and help us sort of shift what we're experiencing. I think support mapping can also be a helpful tool to bring into crisis planning, of just being like, who else can we add to this team? What are their skills and how can we bring them in? Is there anyone who already knows what's up with you? Are there other people who know that this is how you feel sometimes, or how you might be feeling right now? Because holding that alone is a lot. And I don't totally recommend that you do that. I want to talk just for a second about coping strategies and harm reduction. I think sometimes it's happened that you could say something like, okay, what's going to get you through the next 10 minutes, the next 15 minutes? And the person you're supporting is like, I'm going to get shit-faced. And if you're someone who has a little bit of information about risk factors for suicide, you might be like, oh, fuck, that's terrifying. You might actually be more likely to attempt suicide or to complete suicide if you're high or if you're drunk. And there is some truth to that, right? Like that information exists. And also, if the only thing someone can think of to do to save their own life is to get fucked up, then like, I'm not going to take that away from them. So I try to use a harm reduction kind of framework when thinking about coping strategies that might carry risk. And so I think of that as having kind of two principal strategies. The first one is delay or substitute. So if somebody's talking about wanting to drink a beer, you might see if they'd be willing to drink a fizzy water or to take a shot of apple cider vinegar or like consume something else and then just like check. Did that do anything? Did it shift your desire for a beer? If you try 2 or 3 things, a little bit of time has passed. Maybe that's helped. Maybe one of those things has helped, and maybe it hasn't. And so try 2 other things first as like a strategy. With something like cutting, self-harm, a kind of like delay substitute strategy could be like holding an ice cube in your palm, or drawing on the part that you would cut with a red marker, or snapping a rubber band, or tweezing hairs. Try 2 of those things. If none of those things bring you any relief and the time that's passed hasn't brought you any relief, then do the thing that carries some more risk. And then the kind of second arm of that harm reduction strategy is around trying to support a risky coping strategy with some safety measures. So if someone's going to do something that carries a bit of risk, like, is there a way to do it a little bit more safely? So would you take an Uber instead of your bike if you're going to drink? Would you drink at home with a pal instead of alone? If you're cutting, do you have like clean gear and sharps container and those kinds of things? Not alone is better than alone, generally speaking. And for some people, that kind of frame is also helpful to think about in the context of people who have the means to carry out the suicide that they may have planned. So for some people, it's really helpful to like have those things be far away. If they're in crisis, they're like, please take away my pills, or like, please take away my razor blades. And other people are like, the only way that I can survive is if I have those things close to me, because I know that I've built myself an escape pod, and the existence of the escape pod makes it possible for me to continue living. So I think that's one of those places where we try to believe the people that we're supporting about what they need. Ideally have conversations about it outside of crisis moments, about what helps in those moments and what doesn't. And I think those pre-negotiations are also places where we can kind of get, it's really tricky, right? I'm giving this as like this is a bit edgy in terms of advice, but to like try to get pre-consent for things that people might hate when they're in crisis, right? If somebody's when they're actively in crisis, they really don't want you to call their mom, but when they're not in crisis, they're like, my mom actually really helps and I'm mad about it and it sucks and I'm going to be embarrassed later. But when I'm in crisis, I actually do want you to call my mom. And then when they're in that crisis and they're like, don't call my mom, you can be like, okay, I'm not actually violating your consent in this moment because you've told me previously in a calmer moment where you had more of your capacities and more of your skills available to you, that actually this is something that you wanted. And it kind of can take some of the pressure off of supporters to make those decisions in a really ad hoc way about what things we listen to and don't listen to when someone's in a crisis. It's just a little example, but I think there's some possibilities for pre-negotiating some kinds of consent around crisis. All right. Boundaries. I have come to believe over time that the kindest and most supportive thing that we can do as supporters is to be as honest and realistic as we can with ourselves and the people we're supporting about what we can do, and then follow through. And that's a hard assignment. I think learning about our boundaries for a lot of people is like a lifelong battle, and not a particularly easy one, and not one that we're given a lot of instruction about how to do. And I also think it might be one of the most important things. So I want to say a few things about boundaries. The first one is that it's not actually your job to keep somebody else alive. It is not your job to keep somebody else alive, and sometimes you can't. And if that happens to you in the future, or that has already happened in your life, it isn't your fault. Really and truly, it is not your fault. I believe that. I believe that with my whole heart. And also it's really hard to hold on to those beliefs in moments where somebody is in crisis or when somebody has died. And so those are things that I repeat to myself a lot. That's a strategy that I use, is to remind myself of those facts, to say, it's not my job to keep someone else alive. Sometimes I can't. And if that happens, it's not my fault. I think there's some really compelling reasons why holding boundaries, even with people who are suicidal, even with people who are in crisis, why that's a useful thing to do. One is that it serves the support work. The support that you offer when you are okay is better than the support you can offer when you are not okay. And so it serves our relationships, it serves our own capacity, it also serves the people we're supporting, for supporters to know what their boundaries are and to be able to hold them and hold them with integrity. The second reason is that a no makes a yes more believable. You are a more trustworthy supporter if you say no sometimes and you mean it. A lot of people who are suicidal in an ongoing or recurring way carry a lot of shame and a lot of worry about being too much, about being burdensome, and about being abandoned for those reasons. And so if a supporter kind of always shows up, always says yes, never sets any boundaries, it can be really easy for that person to develop the narrative, whether it's true or not, that you're only doing that out of a sense of obligation and fear, and that you don't actually want to be doing the things that you're doing. And that someday you'll stop. You just won't show up anymore. And so it actually can be reassuring. It can actually build trust and safety if you're honest about the things you can't do. Because a lot of people who are suicidal in ongoing ways have been abandoned in those ways, have been ghosted on. I want to offer a couple of strategies, ways to set boundaries with people. My favorite, and this came from a workshop, this is definitely not my idea, but I use it all the time, is to be proactive about setting our boundaries rather than just waiting for people to ask us for things and then either saying yes or no to them. So what that looks like is when you're supporting someone, you think about, who is this person? What is our relationship? What's my capacity? What are my skills? And then make 3 offers. I could show up at your house with a roast chicken. You could come and sleep on my couch. I could call you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Would any of those things feel good to you? If the answer is no, try 3 other things and only offer things that you would legitimately do. What you're doing isn't just making specific offers that are a whole lot easier to accept than it is to ask for something, especially if you're feeling particularly devalued or worthless. The other thing you're doing is offering a sort of snapshot of what your capacity is. So those 3 offers of like the roast chicken, the couch, and the 9 a.m. call, all of those are things that are like in the next 24 hours. Some of them involve me going somewhere, right? I've given that person some information about what I'm willing and able to do. And so that means if they want pizza, but not a roast chicken, they might be more comfortable asking for that because I've offered something that's kind of close by. That's kind of like the baseball field that's on that side. The part of that analogy is like those 3 bases or those 3 offers. And then you've given that person a bit of a snapshot of the field of like what might be available. So I think that kind of proactive boundary setting can be really, really helpful. And I really recommend that people use that kind of strategy. It's sort of the more specific and concrete version of the like, what do you need? Can I do anything? Which are like loving and sweet offers, but can be really difficult to answer, especially if somebody's in a lot of distress. And then the other kind of strategy that I can offer you around boundary setting is one that's more reactive. So if somebody has asked for something and you have the feeling of like, I'm not actually sure I can do that. And the strategy is no but. So no, I don't think I can do that, but let's find someone who can. Or I don't think I can do that today, but I might be able to tomorrow. Or I don't think I can, but it makes a lot of sense to me that that's something that you want. Find a but for your no, and offer that as a way to affirm that person while also holding your boundary. Just because I think boundaries are like real and good and we should have them and hold them doesn't mean that people will always love them or feel great about them. You might get pushback on your boundaries. People might feel hurt by your boundaries. And I think those things are okay. That is allowed. But I had a lot of fear about setting boundaries in situations with people who are suicidal, and overwhelmingly, like, there have been some initial reactions that were hard, but over time, I think it's really built relationships that are stronger and can hold a lot more. And so if that's something you haven't done a lot of, but might be willing to do, I think it's a worthwhile experiment to try. One of the kind of like tasks that we have to do in that is like figure out what our capacity even is. And I certainly can't give you all of the information about that, but I have a couple of clues, things that have been helpful for me. The first one is to try to figure out what are the things, what are the physical sensations, what are the emotions, what are the thoughts that come up when you're hitting a limit, or maybe even when you haven't quite yet hit a limit, but you think you might soon. Because the work of boundary setting is also easier to do while you're still okay, rather than if you're doing it while you've kind of already crossed your line. That's the moment when people sometimes are more likely to ghost or just not show up for something because they don't even know how to say the no because they're already past their limits. So try to hold on to a little bit of that energy for the boundary setting process. For me, the flag that really lets me know that I'm over my capacity is resentment. If somebody that I love and care about sends me a text and the first feeling I have is resentment, that doesn't mean I'm a shitty person or that I don't care about that person. It means I'm not okay. It means that I need more support, that I'm over my capacity. And so I think that's a place where supporters, especially if you do a lot of support work, can really beat ourselves up for those feelings showing up. And so I want us to be able to frame those feelings as information about our capacity rather than information about us being secretly terrible. You probably aren't secretly terrible. The other kind of like reason I put a weird baseball field on the slide is because I've been thinking about it a lot as an analogy for the ways that we set boundaries, in that I think a lot of folks, maybe particularly like queer women with disabilities and queer women of color, are often pressured to set boundaries at kind of like the most we can tolerate. And so that's kind of like the total edge of the field, like where the ball would be a home run or like totally in the crowd, right? Is like, that's the place where if that boundary is crossed, it's actually not okay. So we set our boundaries often at that place of like maximum capacity. And I want to give you permission to set your boundaries not necessarily there. Maybe you want to set your boundaries at the foul line of like, there's a little bit of wiggle room that if this gets pushed or if this gets crossed, I'm still going to be okay, or okay enough to have a conversation about it, or okay enough to try to work on the relationship, that you're allowed to give yourself a little bit of space. An example of kind of the way that I think about that I'll give you is like a boundary that I set in suicide support that I didn't used to, definitely didn't when I was 13 or even when I was 22, which is that I won't be the only person who knows that someone is suicidal. That's too much for me. What I don't do is make executive decisions about who gets to know and how they get to know. Those are decisions that we'll make together. And I don't necessarily have a super firm timeline about how fast it needs to happen. My kind of like infield version, the like most in my comfort zone, cozy option for me is like, there's a care web. There's lots of folks on it. We can all talk to each other. We don't need permission to talk to each other. It's like everyone has, so in the system, has kind of consented to being in touch and being able to trade off and being able to debrief together. That's my most comfortable place. The place that's more like we're in the outfield, but we haven't crossed the foul line is like, there are other folks involved. I know about them. They know about me, but we're not necessarily in contact. but I have some confidence that if I can't be reached, that like somebody else is on the call list, and that somebody else is like someone whose name that I know. And then the place that's like at the edge, really the maximum that I can tolerate, is that the kind of second person on the call sheet is something like a suicide hotline. And I need some amount of reassurance that that's something that that person has done, would do, could do. And if they haven't done it before and that's the option that they want to select, like we'll call together once to see what that's like. Another just kind of like miscellaneous fact that I want to share with you is that as people who do suicide support, even if you have never been suicidal yourself, you have every right to use a suicide support hotline as a debriefing mechanism. It's hard to find sometimes people who are safe to debrief about, especially if you don't all share kind of values and ideas about what decarceration looks like and going against people's consent. Sometimes those decisions can feel edgy. And so you can debrief confidentially with someone on a suicide support line, and that doesn't compromise the confidentiality of the people you're supporting, as long as you don't use any identifying information like names, addresses. I also wouldn't give my own name or address, but you can just call and be like, I just had a conversation that's really fucking me up and I want to talk about it. And can I tell you what happened? So that's a legitimate use of that kind of service, and you are welcome to access it if it feels helpful to you. Okay, boundaries. This is a place where I want to pause and just see if people have questions about any of those skills that we've been talking about. Yeah. Things you want to ask about or add. Someone said, I'm at maximum capacity with a friend who's in a different city and socially isolated. I might be the only person who knows this friend is suicidal. I haven't been able to find any resources to help her when I'm unable. Do you have any suggestions? Again, with like, only knowing that much information about the situation, the first thing I just want to say is like, that sounds really hard and really intense. And I hope that you're finding ways to get support. I hope you have people to debrief with and ways to kind of like comfort yourself and feel okay. I think it's great that you can notice that you're at maximum capacity and that something needs to shift in that relationship or in that support system. So I think you're on really great footing there. I think it might be helpful, if you haven't done this already, to like let your friend know where you're at, that you're hitting some capacity limits, and that you really want them to have the support that they need. And that means that some other people might need to get added. And maybe that's something that you can negotiate together about who might be able to be added of people that are in their life. And I think, yeah, resources are like helpful if somebody wants them. And if they don't want them, they might not be super helpful. So I think I would lean towards other humans, trying to involve other humans. And that could even look like those other humans not necessarily knowing a lot about the kind of suicide risk, but just being like, this person's having a tough time, or like wanting them to be connected to more people. Okay. Those are some initial ideas that I had. I hope that's helpful. Any other questions that are coming up for people? How do we practice these skills before a crisis so that when it happens, it's a bit easier? Do you suggest role play? How could you get people in our community safety group to learn this practice? That is a great question. I think there's ways that you're practicing some of those skills tonight in terms of like asking those questions. I think role playing is a bit tricky. I haven't historically done a lot of role playing in workshops around suicide because somebody has to pretend to be suicidal and it's just like kind of rough. That can be like a really emotionally tricky place to ask somebody to go. So I think practicing those, like the questions about suicide alone, can be helpful. I think we can practice the kind of like safety planning stuff in lower stakes ways, just like with pals, being like, let's have a conversation about what it looks like when we're not okay, or like what it looks like in our worst moments and what kind of support feels good to us. It doesn't have to be directly about suicide, but that can be kind of a preparation for conversations about suicide later if that comes up. And I think like kind of remaining connected to this kind of like information and narratives around suicide. So I think there is like a usefulness to like reading things about suicide, or reading the zine, or like participating in workshops that have a similar kind of frame about what the skill sets are, can all be like useful strategies for practice. Someone asked, do you have suggestions on how to support individuals who identify they're suicidal but are incarcerated? And if we report it to the jail, the response is a form of punishment. Should we report or no? That is a really great question, and also a really hard question. And ultimately, I think, I mean, I'm a police and prison abolitionist. I think that anyone getting punished for having a feeling is like extremely wrong and dangerous. And so I probably wouldn't myself report a situation like that. I would probably follow some of these other kind of like skill sets and strategies in terms of holding space with that person, trying to maybe do some safety planning with that person, thinking through if there are ways for their support network to expand. And if they're identifying that they're suicidal, they may also be able to identify like what would help them feel less that way, or what kind of support would be useful to them in that situation. But yeah, I think reporting sounds like it has more potential to be harmful than to be helpful in that specific situation. Another question says, what's your suggestion for how to help folks who are so scared of talking about suicidality because they're scared of being hospitalized against their will? How do you negotiate involuntary hospitalization as a professional care worker? Great question. So in the kind of like part where we talked about like what you do if you ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal and they say no right away, something that you can do, or you may want to do for situations like that, is develop a kind of like 1 or 2 liner like elevator speech about your thoughts and feelings about suicide support. So for me, what that sounds like is, you know, are you thinking about suicide? No. Well, if that's something that ever comes up for you and you want to talk about it with me, you can know that I'm never going to call the cops. Right. And that may or may not be the same thing that you would say. And that might depend a little bit on like what you know about their life, right? But being able to say like, here's where I stand, here are my ethics around this, here are my limits around this, can let somebody know if you are or are not a safe person for them to talk to about it. Because incarceration, involuntary hospitalization is a form of incarceration, and for some people is really, really dangerous. There are people who I know who've benefited from like being in 72-hour lockup, and also it's like really a rough situation if people aren't consenting to it, and if it has the potential to be really, really harmful for people. So I would say if you are a person who doesn't believe in that kind of hospitalization, or you wouldn't facilitate that kind of hospitalization, that's something you can be transparent about with the people that you're supporting. And then you have to also hold that line of, yeah, not participating in their incarceration. In terms of like professional context, I'm not going to get too much into that because it's just a lot more complicated, but a super brief kind of thing that I can say about that is that different professions have different kind of guidelines about when it's necessary to report suicide. And I think we are taught in a lot of those professions to lean really hard towards reporting. Like if you're not sure, report. And I think you can lean the other way of like, if you're not sure, don't, or if you're not sure, have a conversation about it. Or I think we can develop practices of ways to be more transparent with people that we work with about the circumstances under which we would or would not report, so that they can choose what they say or don't say to us. And that also takes like practice to figure out, and ideally like supportive colleagues and other people who share your values who you can talk to about it. And that can be really, really tough to find depending on what your profession is. Okay, I'm going to take these two questions, or this one more question that I see here, and then I'm going to pause. What is your suggestion for how to help folks who, oh, sorry, that's the one I just read. It's there twice. Great, we already talked about it. There's also a comment that the Gerstein Center takes a non-psychiatric approach, and that's a really helpful resource for Toronto-based folks. Yeah, I've heard that they do some good crisis work. I don't have direct relationships with Gerstein. Okay, I want to say one more kind of thing that I think falls into the realm of boundaries, and that's around, it's another kind of sticky place, and that's around manipulation. So when I do this as a workshop, we talk through some scenarios, and one of the scenarios is somebody kind of threatening suicide if you don't stay or if you don't do this. I will, or I might in my life. And typically what happens when somebody reads that scenario out loud is that like half the people in the room like stiffen because they've been there, because they've had that situation from one side or the other or both. And so I just want to really briefly kind of talk about the idea of manipulation. So like, it's not okay for people to threaten you. That's like pretty bad behavior. And people sometimes resort to bad behavior when they're not okay. And so like, if we're talking about a situation where there's been, abuse in a relationship, and this is just like another ingredient or another flavor of that abuse that's happening, you absolutely do not have to stand for that. And it like should not be used to control you or your choices. And also sometimes there are situations where we're not talking about a relationship of pervasive abuse, but somebody choosing a really terrible communication strategy in a moment where they don't have all of their skills around them. I've come to believe over time that almost all human behavior is actually manipulative. We're all kind of like flailing around like Muppets trying to get our needs met. And sometimes we do that gracefully and with kindness, and sometimes we don't. And I don't think that means we're terrible if we sometimes fail at communicating well. People learn the strategy of making threats because it works, and sometimes because it's the only thing that works, and they won't be taken seriously, or they won't be believed, or they won't be cared for unless they do things that are really intense. And so I think if we're not talking about a situation of pervasive abuse, and if you have the capacity in moments like that, what I would advise you try to do is hear the suffering that person is experiencing, and to support that and be with that. And then later, when the crisis has passed, you can have a conversation about the threat. And you can set a boundary that you can't threaten me, and if you do that again, it's not going to work. I wanted to be there for you in that moment because I care about you and I want you to be okay, but I need you to ask me differently if you want my support again. That just feels like an important scenario to kind of like name and talk about a little bit. And I'm going to lead us towards closing. So I just want you to take a moment and think about if there's a piece of this workshop that stood out to you, surprised you, or challenged you. And you can just like hold that for yourself, or if you feel like it, you're welcome to also share it in the chat. I'm not going to read a bunch of them out. They're just like things to think about. And then I also want you to take a moment to consider if there is a commitment that you can make to disrupting the silence around suicide in your life, in your family, in your community. And again, if you have a commitment that you want to make and that you want to share, you're welcome to do that in the chat. I want to express my overwhelming appreciation for all of you for showing up. This is like a very big crowd. And even though doing work around suicide can be really heavy and really difficult, it has been very hopeful for me to connect with other people who are willing to, who would support people in decarceral ways inside of our communities. And so it's nice to feel like the team is growing, and I have a lot of hope for that team continuing to grow. So thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for thinking about these things with me, and thinking about the ways that you might carry these ideas or these skills into your world.
Thank you so much, Carly, for that honest and compassionate speak on a heavy topic. But you are leaving, and it's funny that you mentioned hopeful, because I said, but you're leaving us with hope for better. So thank you for that. And unfortunately, this is the last workshop of the We Keep Each Other Safe webinar series for Social Justice Week. We were planning on doing a police observing session, but we are going to be postponing that. So just stay tuned for when that will be rescheduled. And also too, we would like to thank all the wonderful speakers that we've had for the past 4 days who have so generously offered their time this week to share their knowledge, insights, and resources with us. I would also personally just like to thank the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project and all the volunteers and the folks behind the scenes that make these webinars and bring all these great people together. So again, we will have recordings up for the sessions within a few weeks. And good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and stay well.